Thank you. Sermon title, Smoke and Medals. Smoke and Medals. You probably know the story, but it remains a good story, and I think good stories can be shared more than once, about a boy, around 9 years old, in the narthex of a church. And like all other churches, there was this plaque there with names on it. Everywhere you go around here, you will find a plaque designating something, honoring somebody. And it was the same. There was this plaque with 2 dozen names on it. And the boy looked at it intently and then asked the head usher, "Who are these people? Why are their names on this plaque?" And the head usher said, "Those are the names of people who died in the service." Upon which the boy said, "Which service, the 8:30 or the 10:30? I think trying to minimize risk there. It's good to try and perhaps sometimes see the light side of things as well, when we consider a very complex and a serious and sometimes grave and solemn theme like Veterans Day. If we wade into all the complexities around the day, there are very few things that one can say, this is clear-cut. There is always, as is the case with war, smoke and mirrors involved. There is the surface that you see, but when you go skin deep or even a little bit deeper, you are confronted by things that astound you or that saddens you and sometimes that appalls you. We'll listen to two interesting passages, one from the Old Testament and one from the New. In the passage from the New Testament, Jesus was talking about what the translators of that passage summarized with the heading, "The Cost of Discipleship." What it means and what it requires. What are the implications of saying, I am a disciple of Jesus? I want to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And this is a very rich passage, and I wish we had time to really dig into it and unearth some of the treasures that one can find there. But for the purposes of this sermon, I want to focus on that assessment by the king about war. Is it wise for me to engage war with my 10,000 against somebody that comes to me with 20,000, etc., etc.? And then in the extreme, Jesus makes the several statements not only about the war, but the cost of discipleship in general. There are consequences, and it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost that you have to consider. Now, the passage in the book of Joshua is, I think, a well-known passage because of the walls that came down after they marched around it for 7 times. And I don't think it's necessary to go into the archaeology of this narrative and say, okay, they didn't really have walls that could fall down, it was more earthen mounds and so forth. Leave that stuff behind. It's a good story, but it's also a horror story. Because here we have religiously motivated, divinely sanctioned, divinely commanded massacre of civilians with the soldiers and the king, where God said, the walls will come down and you go straight, each one of you Israelites, go kill everything, destroy all life. But keep the nice stuff, the copper and the silver and that, keep it for God. That is my portion of the loot. But you go and kill all life, including cattle and sheep and donkeys. Exterminate all life. I wonder what would happen today if such a massacre would take place. I think our knee-jerk reaction is there will be an outcry. No, social media will explode and Twitter will go berserk. And the media will have more than enough material. And there will probably be commemoration of that in some form in the future. But I'm not so sure that there will indeed be an outcry. Because we observe quite often massacres of civilians that go on for years, where we as a nation have a presence in some form, or where the media at least share the information with us, or where they don't and it just carries on, or as in the case of some African nations, decades afterwards, there is upheaval and an outcry, this should never happen again. So I'm not so sure that the story in Joshua is so much different from what we experience today, including the religiously motivated and divinely sanctioned, or claims that it is divinely sanctioned, that we see still today. In the name of God, wars are still prosecuted. So it seems to me that if we look on Veterans Day at war and everything around it, and specifically at civilians, that there is perhaps an official policy like the Geneva Convention, and then there is the reality of what happens when war occurs and war is waged. If you just look at the number of civilian casualties over let's take the last century. The wars in the beginning of that century, 10 to 15% of the casualties were civilians, people not uniformed. During World War II, 50% of the casualties were civilians. Towards the end of the century, 75% the casualties of war were civilians. It's clear what the trajectory is. And I don't know what the reason for that is, but it is appalling. And it is good perhaps to remember for us, especially, and I'm not saying people in the audience, but there are people who really like war. You know, we should, as the superpower in the world with the best military, just go to war. It may come back to bite us, because civilians make up by far the biggest portion of casualties. Perhaps it has to do with the thinking that war is total war these days, that everything and everybody in a nation that is at war with another nation could be considered an asset that can be legitimately attacked. There are a lot of opinions surfacing and being validated, sometimes in interesting places, that voice that perspective. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that war is no longer a face-to-face combat scenario most of the time, but it's conducted almost like a video game, quite often, at very long distances, thousands of miles, where there is no direct observation of, I'm trying to kill this patient, this person who I look in the eye, or who I can see moving. If we look at the cost of war, the budget request for the year 2020, the fiscal year, that was submitted is $220.2 billion. $220.2 billion. Now that is mostly the cost of taking care to an extent of those in uniform and their immediate relatives sometimes as a result of war, of their exposure or their involvement in war, or just being in the service, being in uniform. It is a huge cost, but I think the biggest cost is often not considered or factored into our thinking about it. Because it's not only the people in uniform that are affected, but everybody around them. Often they are the ones that bear the biggest brunt as a result of war. They are the ones who have to deal and suffer with their loved ones experiencing PTSD and other such ailments, suffering sometimes for the rest of their lives. They are the ones who have to bear the brunt of those that were unfortunate to survive, especially with the deadly nature of weaponry these days. Perhaps we need to consider the day, Veterans Day, which became Veterans Day in 1956, where it previously was Armistice Day. It was commemorated on, or it was commemorating on honoring the armistice signed between the Allies and Germany on November the 11th at 11 o'clock, 1918. And I want to read you what Woodrow Wilson said when he proclaimed November 11 as the first commemoration of Armistice Day. To us in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of the nation. That same spirit was honored by Congress in 1926 on Independence Day, when they passed a resolution which, among other things, contained the following. Whereas the 11th of November 1918 marked the cessation of the most destructive, sanguinary, and far-reaching war in human annals, and the resumption by the people of the United States of peaceful relations with other nations, which we hope may never again be severed. And whereas it is fitting that the recurring anniversary of this date should be commemorated with thanksgiving and prayer and exercises designed to perpetuate peace through goodwill and mutual understanding between nations. I think it is perhaps time for us on Veterans Day to consider that Armistice Day nature of what Veterans Day initially was. That is not to say we should not honor those who wore uniform and who served with noble intentions. I chose the sermon Smoke and Medals because thinking back about my own involvement in war on a different continent, there is one thing that I can always remember from those encounters is the smoke. There would always be fire. The forest or the bush would catch fire. You had to negotiate and conduct the combat around the fires that were always burning. And then you had this black smoke when vehicles were set alight. Rubber and other materials, plastics, black smoke, or structures, homes, etc., that caught fire. And in war, as Aeschylus said, the Greek playwright in the 6th century BC, in war, truth is always the first casualty. I think it behooves us to remember that. To look past the smoke and mirrors that deceive and the deceptions and the cover-ups, and consider that war is often waged in the name of a good economy, which is most often just plain greed. Or war is waged quite often to save a fumbling politician from going down, and then putting on the cloak of patriotism and asking of others to buy into that as well. I want to return to that passage that I mentioned in the beginning, the cost of discipleship. While we honor those who served, while we respect what they did, and without declaring all wars as not justified, or saying that people involved in war are bad people, I think the cost of being a follower of the one who also has the title of the Prince of Peace, the cost of being his follower is to always and consistently work for peace. Work for peace that is a just peace, that will result because of justice, and that is not enforced through violence. And while we do that, may we also compassionately carry those among us, in our community, in this nation, carry in our hearts the suffering, sometimes on a daily basis, of those who served, giving their all. Consider the cost of not only to our own, but to others involved in the wars that we wage and that we are asked to wage. Consider the cost also to the truth when it is sacrificed, when promises are made, for instance, to the Afghan interpreters that fought with us and that were promised citizenship of the U.S. and now are left to be dealt with by the Taliban. And in most recent history, the Kurds that are left to be destroyed by whoever choose so. Let us, as followers of Jesus, not sacrifice the truth, but above all, live in God's Spirit and be guided by God's Spirit to be people of peace, while we honor those who served to try and achieve peace as well. May this be how we contemplate Veterans Day, so that the pain and the suffering of so many involved may not be tried to be covered up by just awarding one more medal. May God lead us in that way. Amen.